discussion goes from there. So we won't get to me at the end of this.
We'll try to. Okay, so I have a nice list here of different types of data archives. I think one of the first things to be aware of as a user is that there are general archives that are for all kinds of ecological and evolutionary data. And then there are archives that are more specialized towards particular kinds of data. So amongst the general archives, the one I'm going to highlight 3 of them. There's Dryad, or Data Dryad as its full name. There is the Knowledge Network for Biocomplexity, KNB. And then there is the ESA's ecological archives and their data archives papers that you heard something about if you were here yesterday from Don Strong. Okay. There's a whole series of more specialized archives. So some examples of those would be things like GenBank for DNA sequences is probably one of the outstanding success stories in ecology and evolution as something that's been very widely adopted and it has become standardized. Then you've got things like TreeBase for phylogenetic trees. You've got GEO, G-E-O, the acronym for microarrays, VegBank for vegetation plots, and there's Quasi-HIS for hydrology data, and it's a funny acronym. But the advantage of these more specialized archives is that they're easier as a user to get certain types of data into them, and the complexity of the problem those archives are dealing with is reduced because they're not considering all different kinds of data. And we heard from about the Merit project at CDL yesterday as a project that is even broader beyond the bounds of just ecology and evolution and could take literally almost any kind of digitized data. And beyond the archives themselves, you've got groups like Data One, which is a group that is concerned with the interconnectivity of different archives and creating standards that make it that data archives can talk to one another and share information about their contents. Data One also has overlaps with a lot of the archives I've already named and allows us to allows for big complex data sets to be incorporated into a network of archives. It is really within ecology, it's the central, and evolution, it's the central group that is trying to make it that we have a interoperable network of data archives. So as an end user, as the sort of sole investigator, it's probably not something you would deal with very much directly. You're more likely to deal with the individual archives. So returning briefly to, so Data Dryad is one style of archive. It's run through NESCENT, the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, and the University of North Carolina. It has an NSF grant to set it up. It's now in year 3 of a 5-year grant. And I'll reveal my own bias. I'm on the executive board of it because of my role in journal publishing. And Data Dryad is set up as being an ecological and evolutionary data archive with the main unit that is archived being the data from a paper or a research study. And having this connection to published studies means that in some sense the quality of the data and the value of the data has already been assessed by the publication process. It also means that a good deal of metadata that describes the content of that data set consists in the form of the published paper itself. And part of what Data Dryad is hyping is the idea that you could have a DOI, a digital object identifier number, just like every published paper has. You would have one for your data set. And through a different service called DataCite, you could that DOI would be linked to your paper. And so, for example, the American Naturalist will now publish the reference for a data set in the published paper in the American Naturalist. So the readers of your paper can directly access your data. There is Data Dryad works on a per paper deposit basis, and it has different rates depending on whether the journal you're working with is a society journal that pays upfront fees versus if you're just a standalone member. And I believe it's, I may have this slightly wrong, but it's something like, if for a society publication, it would be something like $40 it costs you in extra page charges or to deposit your data. And that's preservation in perpetuity is intended by that, and it's reliant on the service carrying on through time and getting new data from papers. If you are not working for a society, the cost jumps to something like about $120 per paper. But still not huge compared to what page charges are for a lot of journals. The different kind of model to that is the KNB the network, the Knowledge Network for Biocomplexity. And this grew out of the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, NCES, in Santa Barbara, and it is priding itself in being able to take a wide range of different kinds of data. I would have had a slide in the background at this point, but it sort of has taxonomic data, biometric data, data that's directly relevant to rates of evolution, speciation. It has data organized from the molecular and cell level up to ecosystems and global things. It also classifies things into different categories of ecological data, different habitat types, and so on. And one thing that the Knowledge Network for Biocomplexity has been heavily involved with is the development of EML. EML is an acronym for the Ecological Metadata Language, and I'll return to that in just a minute. Let me go there straight away. Yeah, go straight there now. So the idea of metadata is to create so-called bright archives where the data within them is readily discoverable, and not only discoverable by you as a researcher sitting at a search engine, but also discoverable by other machines that are searching out data for you. So there's a higher level of data parsing and of a more strict standard that applies in order to have machines that can talk to one another through the World Wide Web. And the most metadata that we're talking about now is using the XML language, the extensible markup language. It's used widely in World Wide Web applications. So this has been standardized by World Wide Web applications already and can be built on through metadata services. This particular one, the ecological metadata language, has sort of features of being modular, so it can be easily added onto as new terminology is developed, and terminology that spans from being very general down to rather specific things about particular data sets can be included.
So Marcel, you've given us this rather large collection of the available data repositories out there. Can you walk us through a little bit how, as an author, you sort of navigate that choice? Do I decide to put this in Dryad? Am I considering it at the moment of publication, or am I considering it before publication? And then as a researcher trying to use data, how you also look at that same set of choices? What sort of features you're looking for?
I'll give an answer, then I'll turn it over to these guys who are far more knowledgeable than I am, I believe.
Great.
So, if you have a data set that's connected with a published paper, then probably the easiest option to you as a user is to go to Data Dryad, I believe. In terms of it has a way of connecting that data rather easily to your publication. If the journal you're publishing in has made a formal arrangement, it may be that on acceptance of your paper, you would get an email that is making the opportunity available for you to deposit your data, but with the necessary metadata from your published paper already having been passed to Dryad. So you don't really have to re-enter keywords and things. They're directly passed to that service. And there is a stub created for your data set. Dryad only takes things from published studies. Okay, so that is a limitation of it. It is if you have data that's not published, that would probably steer you towards the knowledge network for the KNB, the knowledge network for biodiversity. And if you have something that is an especially large, complex, and especially valuable data set, that you're probably, the way that you get most recognition for that at present is probably through if it's an ecological data set, is through the ESA's data archives papers, in that they are vetted for being particularly valuable data.
Is it possible to have it both ways? Like you want, say, the DOI and the recognition that Data Dryad is giving you, but you really want the EML, the markup for your metadata that the knowledge base complexity is giving you.
You can add that to other services as well. And KND, obviously, they as the developers of the EML, this is something that's actually downloadable as a series of modules that you would then steer yourself through to go through the formal process of coming up with metadata if you wish to. But you could then use that metadata with whatever archive you're using. So it's a somewhat general thing. If you're dealing with complex data sets that have many, many parts, it may be that somebody like KNB or Merit is actually much better able to meet your needs. And I'll hand over to you guys.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So they're related, is that the NC's funding runs out September of this year. In essence, funding runs out in 3 or 4 years, and it's been stated in no uncertain terms that they will not get renewed. And what guarantee, I mean, are these funding models, in place to keep these things going? The fees you suggest don't seem large enough to generate keeping things in perpetuity. We all know how sort of pension funds are a demonstration that, depending on future contributions, can be dangerous.
So the Dryad model is based on the idea that there would eventually be about 100 journals that would sign on to that service as requiring data archiving and as a condition of publication of a paper, and that data would go into Dryad. That creates enough revenue, they reckon, economists reckon, to create a workable system. We heard yesterday from the CDL folks about Merit as a flexible data archiving system where there is a fee per terabyte of, I think, $1,000-something, whatever it was, and it seems that systems like that are dependent on continued income in the same way in order to carry on existing in 100 years or whatever. And so, short of getting either some direct government funding that's guaranteed, or to have funding that is from a donor and can form an endowment, it's hard to see how we could do it. We could go.
Yeah, I don't know when to say some of the things I was going to talk about, but so I think GenBank and sequence data is a very useful thing to ponder and think about in this context. So, GenBank is a sequence database that is run by the National Center for Biotechnology Information that gets money from the NIH to do this. And then there are other, there's the European database and there's a Japanese database, and they try and sync with each other with the data that they've been archiving, and it's a federally funded system to share open sequence data, and I can talk about some of the issues associated with that data in a few minutes. But one thing to think about, or to worry about, is one sub-branch of the National Center for Biotechnology Information recently has been an archive called the SRA, the Short Read or Sequence Read Archive, which was a place for people to deposit data from these new sequencing systems that generate massive amounts of data that are very short DNA pieces for not a ton of money. And for this sort of evolved from something called the Trace Archive, which was a place where people put individual reads with the old sequencing technology associated with the genome, the Human Genome Project in particular. The Sequence Read Archive has not been working very well over the last few years. It's just the uploading of the data, the annotation with metadata, the type of metadata structure that they have for adding the metadata onto it. And 2 weeks ago, the NCBI announced that they are canceling the SRA. They do not, I talked to David Lippman, who's the head of NCBI, about this, because I posted a blog post attacking the SRA, and then they canceled it. Anyway, we can talk about that some other time. So the SRA is going away, partly because of the unpredictability of the current NIH budget, and no guarantee from Francis Collins that the NCBI will have an increase. In fact, an almost guarantee that the NCBI will have its budget cut in the next round of NIH funding. And the low-hanging fruit at NCBI right now are a couple of systems, some that very few people use, and the SRA. And that's just going away. And it's unclear what's going to happen in the community with places to archive short read sequence data, which lots of institutes are generating massive and massive amounts of it. This is what I said yesterday. A new Illumina sequencing machine can generate a terabase of data in a run. Run takes about a week, so you can figure out how many terabases you're going to generate. The Beijing Genome Institute has bought 130 of these machines. Davis has one of these new machines. I'm sure we'll have more, and every institute has many. It is completely unclear what's going to be the recommended practice for these massive sequence collections in the short term or the long term. And I know that many ecological and evolutionary data sets are not of the size of these SRAs, but many of them are very complex. And if you want to have any type of sort of archiving and adaptability of the system to deal with new types of metadata and to do with new types of searches, it's expensive to maintain these systems.
So these databases have been funded by grants specifically for the maintenance of that database that are expiring?
Some of these are, but what I'm saying is even an NIH-funded, internationally recognized database that was trying to adapt to the changing landscape of technology in sequencing is giving up on being the place to archive the data. And the discussion right now is that they're going to be distributed archives set up, unclear exactly who's going to run those distributed archives or who's going to fund those, and that the data may be transient.
So Marcel, and maybe John will speak to you, Marcel was mentioning an author-funded version of the database rather than, right now, Dryad, if I understand, is funded by NSF grants, but is looking to be funded per publication.
It's already getting some income from publications.
And relative to what Jonathan just said, that NSF sort of very specifically says that they are not in the same business that NIH is in. They do not sort of fund services like this or fund institutes, etc. They sort of fund institutes, but they're not in some sense ever thinking of anything other than starting something and expecting that they are an innovation agency rather than a sort of a maintenance agency. So for ecological data, it's a much more even worrisome.
And I think it is very, I think we really have to think of this landscape of where things are going to be in 3 years or 5 years, or how to set up the system such that the data sets are easily transferable to other places, or that they're distributed. I mean, I don't know the solution. I'm not an IT person, and I'm not. But I think that this, given that even an institute like NCBI with a $50 million budget is hurting in terms of keeping up with one type of data. I think we need to really think about the longevity of these systems. And this goes back to what I mentioned just in passing yesterday, which is I think we need to keep the overall goal here in mind, which is the progress of science and the reproducibility, et cetera, and that in some cases, I mean, I want all data to be archived and accessible openly at the time of publication, et cetera, but we have to be very careful with how we mandate or recommend how to do this so that we're not compromising something else by something being too expensive. I mean, this is NSF's worry, and I understand NSF's worry that they realize how expensive it is, and that's why they say they want to be an innovation agency. They don't have the budget to deal with this type of thing.
I think there are some things like, from the library's perspective. I'm John Kunze from the California Digital Library. And we're in the business of sort of long-term access, and thinking about this, we've been aware of various things. Like for 15 years ago, the cyber infrastructure became this concept of trying to get NSF and other funding agencies to take a slice of every grant and some percentage and move that towards sustainable infrastructure. So you create research, you create infrastructure, and somehow it should be sustained. That never really got off the ground, but taking another run at it is the DataNet program from the NSF. So there are 2 awards. One was the Data One project that we're on, and Data Conservancy is the other one. And both of them have as tasks to create, to try to create sustainable business models. Every single, I mean, it's just a catch-22. All research funding is, it's short-term. It's just, it stops, and then now what do we do? So it's just complete paradigm shift is required, and they're hoping to start some kind of fire here that will create sustainable business models. So Data One has a sustainability working group. Data Conservancy has one as well, and we're supposed to combine forces. I should also mention that outfits like libraries have traditionally been subsidized, but every budget is under attack, ours included. One thing to think about in this is if there are live data sets that during their lifetime have all sorts of bells and whistles and access. And there are others that are sort of more sleepy, sort of in repose, we can save this stuff. We may not be able to provide all the bells and whistles, and that actually can help us save more, even with lower functionality, and if the user is going to go to more work.
So this is what I proposed NCBI do for the SRA, at least temporarily, was not try and add all the bells and whistles,
Right.
which is what has made it complicated and costly, but at least be the repository, the dead archive, as opposed to the live archive.
So at least with some effort, you can still get the stuff out.
Yeah.
I'll just say one last thing. One of the more innovative models I've seen is one that's kind of a challenge for our institution is sort of creating endowments. We don't normally have any sort of ability to carry forward money from year to year in our budgets, which is a difficult institutional problem. But if we can get the right people convinced, the Internet Archive has this group that's talking about endow a terabyte, and sort of show up with more or less, I think it's probably a factor of 10 times what the storage would cost today to buy. If you can set up an endowment and hopefully it will throw up enough interest to actually sustain it in the future. But we have to actually earmark those funds so that they can't be taken away, and we're designated for that purpose. So we have to get very creative with business strategies.
So we've looked at things going, do you feel like it's moving in the direction of more being paid for by authors, or being paid for by publishers, or being paid for by the funding agency directly? Are we converging on one of these solutions? Are we trying to
I think all of
Do
those are still on the
diversity.
table. I don't see any convergence just yet.
I see more fragmentation. It's like the British Environmental Research Council is setting up its own archive for their researchers. The Royal Society of London is setting up its own archive for data in its journals. We heard yesterday from Don Strong that the Ecological Society of America has some thinking that reflects a similar kind of pathway. And then you've got all these groups at different levels with different kinds of archives acting in different ways as well. So it seems like we're at a point of fragmentation, and some of these archives presumably eventually become more successful than others and more permanent than others.
And there's another interesting issue, maybe epitomized by NEON, the National Ecological Observatory Network, which, as they put it, the rate at which they will generate data, that you're not going to want to ever shift their data around because you don't have the capacity to do so. And it's got to be typical. So what the plan is, more or less, is that you would access the data by manipulating it at their site and then ship essentially summary products around. And one problem that comes up there is that they will do various pre-processing, and you may or may not agree that they're doing that correctly.
Yeah, this is exactly what just the raw sequence data producers have been talking about, is like with the linear, the particle accelerators and things like that, sort of jointly writing code to rapidly process the output in some way that is mutually agreeable, such that you're storing less of the total raw output. And as I said before, in some cases it's cheaper to read than it is to store and move around the data. So again, if you have access to the samples. It's complex what happens, especially as the fragmentary nature that's happening with all these different systems, I think is good in some sense, because we have to experiment, we have to try and test a bunch of different models. But it's risky in some sense because your place you put your data may disappear.
I'm wondering if it sounds like there's a bit of a mixture of purposes in that you want to have data archived from particular studies from a provenance point of view or for reproducibility assessing, and then there's whole other huge data sets out there that aren't necessarily related in that way, and we want access to those climatic data or short sequences. I think are two good examples of that. Does it matter if we're not differentiating in this conversation between those, or are there different rules for each that result in different archiving solutions?
No, I think that's why I was saying I think we have to talk about the purpose in every one of these cases, and it's not uniform at all. I mean, I think that some of the purpose is this provenance thing that is allowing people to redo exactly what you did in the course of your project, so that there's a package that is just associated with a specific paper or a specific study. And then there are other issues which are very different, whether it's I think that it's very specific to individual goals, and I think that.
Could you give us some examples of this is a case where it's really clear, like this is the goal with this kind of data, this is the kind of goal we need with archiving. Like it doesn't help to archive it without the bells and whistles.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, rather than answering that explicitly, I'll give you a real example of how the way data was stored was inappropriate. Which is, when I was at my previous job, Tiger, the Institute for Genomic Research, we were sequencing the genomes of these bacteria from some letters that were sent to the Senate building and other places. And the FBI wanted us to compare the genomes of these samples to the reference genome that we had previously determined at our institute of the Bacillus anthracis AIM strain. And when we sequenced the original genome of the AIM strain and deposited the data into GenBank, you deposited it at the time as a consensus sequence of the complete genome of this individual organism. And then when we started sequencing the genomes of these AIM strains from these letters, they were nearly identical to the reference genome. They were all very, very closely related, such that it was very hard to distinguish real variants from sequencing error. And if you go back to what we had deposited in GenBank from our own institute, right, was the consensus is actually a model of the sequence. Some bases in the consensus sequence have a high probability of being correct, and some have a low probability of being correct. And we did not store that information in the GenBank entry. And this is partly what led to the creation of a sub-archive at GenBank, which was the genome assembly archive, so that you map to the individual sequence reads to the consensus sequence so that someone could go back and get the actual raw data to say, this individual base that I think is different in the letters in Florida is a high quality difference because we have a good data in the reference consensus, and this individual base is not. So they had to create a whole new way of storing the data that included the raw data because of this issue of nobody was storing sort of the probabilistic model. I mean, so you could have, right now what the solution is, because the sequencing is so cheap, they're not going to store the raw data, but they will store now the model, the statistical significance of some of the consensus data relative to genomics. So I think in that case, this very particular scientific question, which lots of people are asking now, resequencing human samples, resequencing genomes, everybody's doing this now. But that was the first case where people realized storing an average in the database was not the ideal. And I think that we have to be, the problem is we have to be adaptable with these databases. If you want them to be bright, whatever you call it, usable right now as opposed to a pure archive, you have to be ready for the science to change, for the new data types to change, for the metadata to change, and so on. And so I think we're going to have 1,000 different case studies, I think, for all these different, just in ecology and evolution.
So I know one of the ways of making this, dealing with raw data in particular, more tenable in the physics community is there's sort of a tiered level of access depending on how popular a particular piece of data is. So pieces of data that are considered to be potentially important someday, but are not very popular, get dumped off onto a tape, and then eventually the tape gets put away on a shelf, and then eventually the shelf gets put away in a warehouse somewhere. But it's all retrievable by a robot. So when you request an unpopular piece of data, it says, you get an email that says, well, your data is being retrieved. They'll send you another email when it is available. You get an email like a few hours or a few days later that says, here's your data. And storing it that way, so it's just less available, is much, much cheaper in large volume.
Yeah, I'm not an IT person, so I think that to me, the reason the short read archive is having problems right now is the complexity that they created in the metadata portion of the SRA and in the transferring of information and uploading the data and so people generating a terabase of data with one of these sequencing machines, the journals were requiring you to say you submitted your data to the short read archive, and the short read archive was taking sometimes 4 months to get you a record that you could, it was just completely uncoordinated in terms of the culture of doing the science, what the journals were requiring, and how the SRA responded by they tried to enforce real harsh metadata standards and quality standards with the uploads, which made things take a really long time and become very complex and cumbersome. And so it was more the metadata in this case than just storing it. They have the capacity to store it all right now. We don't have the bandwidth to transfer it over there necessarily, but they have the capacity, if you could do it, to store it. It was more the negotiation with them for a DOI equivalent, their GenBank ID, and the metadata standards that made it sort of crash because the community was getting pissed off. People were writing papers and where the journalist was telling them you can't submit your paper until you have a record, and we're like, I've been waiting 4 months for a record. So it was getting very messy.
Impressed.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's a good point, though. I think in most fields, the amount of data is not so much a problem anyway. Physical storage costs something, but I think you can deal with it in most cases. It's a bit of a problem now. And there are some other fields where it really remote sensing, but then NASA takes care of that. So it seems to be that it's really the human resource, the long-term investment in human resources to maintain it, to update it. And the other thing you mentioned is don't make it complicated. So the idea, at least that's what I think I've seen over the past decade when people work on this. Things like EML are great, but there's very little uptake because people don't invest the time to know data in necessarily, and people don't necessarily want to learn how to actually deal with it very well. I mean, it might be in the future, machines will do it for you. But I think those rules, to keep it simple, is number one. And somehow, if I look at the more success stories, I mean, GenBank, the GBIT was another one. The more you can organize it by small communities, if you really want to bring things together. I mean, Dry is one model where you say, okay, put everything in, but if you want to organize things, like say weather data, well, there are national meteorological institutes everywhere. They can do it nationally, they can get internationally with WMO, and the opportunities are there, but somehow, I guess all these individual groups sort of need to get their act together and need to get stimulated to start doing that. Like the physics community, I think, has done for much longer.
Yeah,
it's much more cooperative.
Also, like building a particle accelerator, don't build very many of them, but almost anybody, like individual labs can buy sequencing machines now. So,
can you motivate this metadata discussion? And we've seen sort of the trouble it can get into with these repositories, where the metadata sort of locks you into a system that doesn't move with the science. Can you just motivate why this emphasis on metadata in the first place, and how groups are addressing?
Yeah, I mean, this was the one thing I was going to talk about, is this example that's come up in the genomics community, which it has been, we're producing nearly complete or complete genome sequences of a massive number of organisms right now. For microorganisms, the current count is something like 5,000. And one run of this new Illumina machine will generate another 1,000 each time you run it, if you can barcode and do all. I mean, so we're going to have massive collections of complete genome sequence information for organisms. And in the way the data has been put into GenBank, first of all, it's very hard to get some of the metadata about either the way the data was generated or the organism that was characterized out of the GenBank records. And it's not very usable information. So for example, if you wanted to compare all the genomes that are out there right now, I work on mostly bacteria, for bacteria, and try and find out if there were features in common with the human pathogens. There is no structure out there that tells you which of those organisms are human pathogens and which are not. And so a few years ago, there was a group formed called the Standards in Genome Sciences. That's main task was to work on metadata standards for associated with genome sequence reports, genome sequence entries in GenBank. And they've collected together 100 or so people from the different genome centers and microbiologists, et cetera. They've had meetings every 4 or 5 months for the last 3 or 4 years, or maybe even more. They've written a bunch of reports, and they finally came out with their first round recommended metadata table that people could enter information into. They didn't make it easy to do, and nobody did it. And then they finally started to make it a little bit easier for people to enter and also access the metadata associated with these genome papers. And they even now created a whole journal called Standards in Genome Sciences, which will allow people to publish data papers on a genome sequence and enforces a somewhat standardized metadata entry system for these data papers. And now, I haven't seen how many have come out, but now I'm aware of at least, in the last 3 months, at least 20 papers that have been submitted analyzing the genomes using these metadata tables, finding things that nobody was able to find before, because no individual can scan through the entire literature to figure out which one of these organisms, even what their growth temperature is, any of those features. So there was, I know there was an effort to try and do this for a while where they had to hire curators to go through all the literature to look through this information. And instead, if you try and get the community or the actual people sequencing these genomes to figure this out. Not everybody can figure out every entry. This is catalyzing a major change in how comparative microbial studies are being done because of the access to this somewhat standardized metadata. And they're now trying to come out with a metadata standard for environmental sampling for genomics, where you go out and scoop up stuff and sequence from the environment. There's a paper that's in press right now on that from a group of like 150 people that went to all these meetings to come up with these standards.
So there are other examples where we're seeing the existence of that metadata empowering a kind of study that you just couldn't do before. Are we at the point where that is happening in ecology, maybe Marcel or Robert in climate? Does it look like we're moving in that direction, or is the metadata still sort of like nobody knows what the standards are, it's more getting in the way than being useful?
I've looked at a lot in geographic data, and there I found it often that it wasn't that or when it was that it wasn't very useful, because the crucial information, if they don't have it referred to, it just wasn't there. They still have to go to the papers. And so that I find very disappointing, but again, so it might be very dependent on, it is the greatest on where it works. And I'm certainly not against it. I've seen that if you ask a lot of questions that really are not going to be useful, that's just not the way to go. And it could be damaging if it then stops people from sharing data. I'd rather say, let's get going first, and then realize maybe that you did something and start doing that then. So it's just maybe a matter of how the community going. But I haven't myself had a great example like that. So.
It's the only one I have. So
metadata are really difficult. Cuts both ways. It's like it can enable things that can get in the way. Typical, most metadata standards simply don't track the science well enough to stay relevant. And so new models, I think, are emerging where we're seeing things like sort of wiki-style vocabulary maintenance that is very promising, where you basically contribute terms and modify and define things. I think that's very promising. I was wondering, since John, I know you were at the PDF conference, where this concept of the nano publication comes up, where it's essentially kind of like taking standardized vocabularies and then stepping, one level of indirection, assigning unique identifiers to standardized vocabulary terms, so that you have absolutely no problems with pluralization, misspelling, etc. And then turning those into statements, RDF triple the subject, predicate, object, and then, which in theory, will really enable deep searching and machine reasoning for publications. I mean, did you?
No, I think that the publishers would love it if people did this.
Yeah.
I think adoption by the actual people writing papers, this is what came up at this meeting, is only going to happen if there's an easy, intuitive system for trying to do this.
So I would say it will happen, but humans will not do it. Google already generates these RDF triples for every page it searches. They're not always perfectly accurate, but metadata is being generated one way or another. It's just a question of validating it, collecting it.
So then, John, can you just explain for us a little bit more what the triple is and how people are using this sort of semantic markup to make data more powerful?
Well, so the semantic web 2.0, the whole basis is this idea of you create these sort of knowledge network, and this goes back to like 1980s technology, so knowledge networks, where essentially you have a predicate calculus. It involves these three-part, these triples: the subject, predicate, and an object. Predicate is essentially a relationship that stands between the subject and the object. So mosquitoes carry malaria. This is just an example. So carry is a predicate. If you develop, you might have all the proteins that you want to talk about, all the things you want to do to them, and the things that result from that. And you had a vocabulary for all of those, every part of the triple, unique identifiers, and these were somehow represented in your publications in a machine-readable form. Then you could imagine a database, and software could go through and create giant tables, and you could say, subscribe to an RSS feed. So anybody who publishes an assertion that has to do with this protein. I want to know about it. I want to get it on my cell phone in the airplane lounge. And then you can go check it. So in fact, it's sort of short circuit. The idea is to short circuit huge amounts of literature searching, cut out a lot of stuff that you don't need to do, make it just more efficient to communicate, the scholarly communication. That I wander off in the weeds.
No, but that's standardized language and getting people to somehow adopt it or use it, or that's...
Oh, there's no shallow water.
Yeah.
It's all deep water. I have heard of some interesting, like Microsoft Research is working on it. They've got projects where people are creating these authoring systems where you're typing in the words of your paper, and as soon as you type some word, it's being looked up.
Yeah.
It's suggesting references. Is this the reference you want? Can you footnote this? And then, if you type in the name of a protein, I imagine it could go and say, is this the exact, or which of these 5 did you really mean? And these are the kinds of things which could, authoring tools might actually help.
Yeah, I think if you have those authoring tools, people might use it.
Should we tend to talk about the problems of archiving code for...
Yeah, Alan, as we talk about what all this is focusing on, storing data, more and more data is now produced, particularly in our world of theory, by codes and by simulations. What role does that play as like NSF and journals start requiring that data is archived?
Well, it's an extremely valuable thing to do. Sort of amusingly, ancient history, I remember back in the early days when you could get an email each week with had all the new web pages that went up that week. Yes, and one of the exciting ones early on was when NetLive went up on the web. And NetLive is a library of scientific code, primarily written in that wonderful language called Fortran. How many people here actually can code, so that would use Fortran? Oh, physicists? Okay. That makes sense.
I translated it to see your Fortran.
and so one of the reasons to bring that up is that, say, if somebody's solving an ordinary difference equation to this day, in some sense, if you're actually some variant of LODE, you'd want to at least check that you get the same answer with certain aspects, and you would want to use that if you wanted to do various solving of partial differential equations, various optimization approaches, etc. And now some of the similar sort of ideas have been taken up by things like R and others, but so this gives an air of, number one, confidence that what's coming out actually bears some relationship to what you think it should be, and as well lets you do various amount of repeatability. But one thing that's going on is that we're getting to the stage where lots more is being done with various simulations approaches. Agent-based models are sort of all the rage. And one would be very suspicious that a very high percentage of these, unless they're done on a standard platform, and even the ones done on a standard platform, one would be very suspicious that the output does not really reflect what the author thinks it does. I mean, this is a fairly cynical view, but I suspect has a great deal of accuracy. And so if you do not, in the end, require the publication of the code so that people can at the very least duplicate, and maybe not even the code, but actually at least specify the algorithms in a very, very careful fashion that are used, you run into this problem of having no confidence in the results that are produced. I've been associated with enough where we've come close to doing foolish things, and we can look back sort of historically at various aspects. It was well known, for example, that early on the random number generators in a variety of the standard languages were deeply flawed. And again, if people didn't explain what they were doing, their answers suffered. So this is something that we need to kind of step up and really sort of figure out a good way to do. I do not know, I mean, if you publish in sort of numerical analysis, of course you've got to make your code available. If you publish in ecology and evolution, it's less clear that this is being required. And typically it's often not there. And even the times when people do put it there, it may be put in a form that's not, in some sense, machine readable in an easy way. And so this is something that I think is going to be evolving. As places like NSF think about data management, they have to think about what the role is of the models. How are those data? This is an interesting question that comes up.
I have a curious. Do people think that when you publish a paper that everything associated with what is reported in the paper should, at least in theory, be available to other people who request it or want it? I mean, this came up before with whether or not someone can keep a little bit off to the side to protect themselves from being scooped even after they publish a paper. So is there...
I think you run the risk of a masking effect of having far too much information. So it's not...
I don't mean posting it necessarily, but I mean in theory, saying
even just the idea of archiving everything, I think poses that risk of finding the nuggets. So the point of the journal and the original page length and word limitation was that you put the best foot forward and not the best spin, but you describe everything the way as succinctly as possible. That should be the way we position ourselves.
So what about making the...
Which includes code.
Yeah, but so what about making the most important things available? Let's put it that way.
So one thought on this is right now, a number of journals have a policy that says everything required to reproduce the results should be available to the readers of the journal. And as a result, there's no explicit definition of why something is included or not. Because we're saying this summary is sufficient, and that's implicit in just publishing, as opposed to saying the following are included because of these reasons of reproducibility and or the logistical capability of doing them. The following are not. And it would be a very useful exercise to do that as one publishes, to know what to leave out.
Yeah.
I think it should be, I mean, it's not like one size fits all. It sort of depends. But we've had, to ask some senior researcher that's really in a powerful position for his or her data, is really awkward. And so it seems to me a journal or the funding agency should have some requirement there so you don't have to do that because people are reluctant, in particular the more junior types.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's others that over their dead body are they going to release the data? I mean, honestly, some of these ecological data, there's a guy that does turtles down in Tennessee. Probably for 30 years he's got up, mornings with hip boots and, the whole bit. And a huge amount of effort into this, but he's going to take that with him to his grave. There's no way he's going to release it. And it's a shame,
There are lots of journals that require this. We did a study, and some of the research we came across is that people who have tracked, of journals that explicitly require data deposit, how many of them are follow up and police that situation, how many of them police it even after they're informed that the data was not deposited, and there's very little compliance and very little penalty for not depositing data, even in spite of the policies. So evidently we need something stronger.
And so anyone speak to incentives for providing either the data sharing or the code sharing. One of the things you've talked about is having these object identifiers for data as a way to track and using the data. To say maybe a little bit more about that and just let's translate into people sharing their code. Or why do we get into this problem where people say, no, I'm taking my data to the grave?
And there are incentives and there are disincentives too, right? I mean, obviously you don't want to get scooped, and should it be up to the discretion of the author or the people who think it shouldn't be? But I mean, I think that's probably why there has been little enforcement of it. But I'll just say a little bit about we did this study with some Moore Foundation money, looking into the archiving of the focusing initially on the techniques and the algorithms and the processing information, independent of the data. How do you should that be saved as supplemental, in some sort of supplemental form? And we decided it should be considered with the data as a solution, but Going through that, I mean, one of the big incentives would be getting credit. You know, there's currently no credit for academic advancement for people to simply produce data. I guess that's pretty well known. So part of that is in trying to make that cultural change. One thing it seems like people are creeping towards is, well, if we can make it kind of look like a publication, like it gets a citation like a publication, gets a DOI like a publication, it looks and acts and smells like a publication, maybe it can be counted. So I mean, maybe that's a way to start nudging it, but ultimately that's a cultural shift that we can only encourage.
But too, I mean, NSF and NIH has special funds for secondary analysis of data. I don't see that so much in NSF. Maybe they have it, but it's the idea to collect new data rather than try to dig more out of the existing data, which you might have invested a huge amount of money in collecting. So that would be the incentive right there if the funding agencies have those funds available. Every time we've made data available to modelers, for example, they always come in with new perspectives, and so everybody really benefits from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, GenBank is this special case, perhaps, but there's been an evolution in the field, especially with these large-scale sequencing projects where, first of all, people were releasing the data before they published on it, sometimes with restrictions, sometimes without restrictions. We can talk about whether or not that's a good idea. I think it actually is in many cases, in part because you find out things that you may not have found out without doing that. But, citations for the data sets have had a complex history in genome sequencing. And so when you used to publish a genome paper associated with a large genome project, I mean, those papers get more citations than almost anything else about those particular organisms. Almost entirely because people are using the data. And they cite the paper when they use the data associated with that paper. They may completely disagree with any inference made in the paper, and many of those papers are awful, so that's probably a good idea. But the relative cultures in different fields for citing those has been unequal. And so there is this now effort for these data marker papers, is what basically people are calling them, and that's where these metadata papers that I was talking about are. People are writing very brief reports associated with large sequencing projects that are no conclusions really in them. They're just data descriptor papers. And those now are citable objects as well as more comfortable because they're in PubMed for people to think about maybe putting on their CV. Some of them are getting a lot of citations. I mean, like one of them, I don't know why it's had so many citations. One of them has a couple hundred citations, I think, already for just one of these sort of data marker papers.
Hearing this, and it'd be interesting to hear you and maybe Robert address this, that the kind of data you're referring to is much more uniform than the sort of data that ecologists or population biologists generate. As a matter of fact, sort of looking at what NEON is trying to do, which is to try and sort of generate data sort of closer to the spirit of what you've suggested. My sense is that they're actually missing lots of the interesting potential parts of ecological observation. And so one needs to think about a somewhat different model. I mean, it's a very sort of odd thing because you don't want to just compare sequences. You might want to know something about the sort of size distribution of one organism at the same time you're looking at the population dynamics of another that's interacting with it, which at the same time is interfacing with physical environmental variables. And doing this strikes me as a much, much more difficult enterprise.
Yeah, I think we've been spoiled by the success of GenBank because it's simple. I mean, I think that, we shouldn't use it, and yet it's still having a hard time.
So maybe this is a good segue to ask John Clancy to talk about tools that would make from UC3 that would make some of this easier. Because you're same topic. We don't have slides, unfortunately. Are you okay with talking about?
Yeah, so we're not going to do slides at all. So
we can't get them working with no hardware in here that functions, it seems.
All right, well, I have slides.
Yeah, you can just talk us through that.
At least I think it's a cool reminder to.
Well, we can see them up here, but we can't see them down there.
So just a quick reminder of who we are is California Digital Library serves the 10 UC University of California campuses, all their faculty, staff, and students. We work collaboratively with the library, archives, and museums. We've been doing what we do for a very long time, so it gives us some sort of experience in sustainability and long-term sort of access to information. The University of California Curation Center is one of the 5 programs in CDL, and that's what I belong to. Patricia and Stephen saw that yesterday. So among the things that we provide are this Merit, content agnostic repository. We have identifier management tools, easy ID for easy identifier, long-term identifier management. We have a web archiving service as well, which is interesting. It lets you go out and use tools to save websites and bring them in-house.
So maybe highlight the identifiers in the context we were just having of this question of getting credit for different models. You're talking about making everything look like a publication. What other role does providing an ID have? Well,
so the ID is in some sense, it's the most compact reference you have to something. It's hopefully it's unambiguous. If that's all you had, you could at least get back to the citation and then and from there get to the actual content you're interested in. But the unique identifier gives you this hook into all the citation tools, which is tracking impact factors, the things that you need to set up the things that if someone notices that it's heavily cited, then they'll do so by here's a unique string, and we have confidence that in fact we have good numbers on the impact of this. That's a powerful statement. Now, should I go carry on a bit with, with my presentation, or so we have been doing these tools for a long time. We have these microservices. We have identifier services, and heavily involved in metadata. I wrote the Internet RFC for the Dublin Core and chaired the NISO standard group that made it a national standard. So I know everything is wrong with it. And created the Dublin kernel as a result. What we're doing now is, and you heard yesterday about the Merit repository, we have this easy ID, a scheme agnostic identifier manager. So we've done DOIs, ARC identifiers we created. They're alternatives. I could tell you one of those if we had time. But we're going to incorporate URNs. We currently resolve life science identifiers, so we can submit a PubMed ID or a gene ontology ID. It'll redirect you to the right place.
So you're planning to put those tools, these IDs, directly in the hands of the authors, rather than this is something that, say, the publisher or something like Google is going to be sort of after the fact assigning to.
Right.
Data.
So our primary constituency is the University of California, but we've got our first customer for EasyID was Dryad, particularly, and they use the programming interface to go in and create a digital object identifier, DOIs, and report a metadata. So no, they are a very technically sophisticated outfit, but we have individuals, researchers, who are also signing on.
So I could sign on for this and assign a DOI to my code that I'm generating for some simulation, and it would immediately be indexed by these tools like Web of Science.
Right. Is Jim Carey here? I don't know.
Right here.
Oh, you're Jim Carey.
Sure. Yeah.
So you're a customer.
We are.
So anyway, so we're also part of the Data One network. We're partnering that. There's the DataCite Consortium. We're a founding member of the DataCite Consortium, whose purpose is to try to establish this practice of citing data and having it held in regional repositories. We are also creating these data management planning tools, so sets of guidelines. We went and cherry-picked a bunch of existing plans and created our own advice, and we're working on a tool with the Smithsonian and the University of Virginia to help generate these things. We're sort of nibbling away at all sorts of this very complicated problem on different fronts, hoping to overwhelm it or just make it smaller. And one of this in the area of ecological data, I mean, the earth scientists they have a lot of Excel spreadsheets. And so, Excel is this tool which, some people hate, but everybody uses it. It's ubiquitous, it's familiar. If we could make it better, we have a project with Microsoft Research to create an add-in, open source add-in that will, make it more friendly for archiving purposes, allow you to publish directly in an archive, standardized dates, include column headers, etc. And then we're working on this sort of data paper publishing model, pilot for that. The idea is to essentially, create this very minimal kind of wrapper, essentially a couple of metadata elements on a cover sheet, and jam it on top of sort of links to safely archived data that have identifiers given out by, for example, our identifier service.
So would that be for unpublished data sets as well as published ones? Or
this would be a publication. So if you wanted to publish twice, I guess.
Just for publishing data sets?
Just for publishing data sets.
So it doesn't have to be based on a published paper?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of this sort of future of the scientific publication in theory. Your analysis paper would cite the data paper as where the data came from.
Right.
You could publish them at the same time, or you could release the data early.
So how does this change the landscape? That future, say, a 10-year review committee looks at citation counts, and they won't be able to avoid counting these citations or whatever, right?
We need to redo the entire system of 10-year review.
We hope to actually do more than count.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you're giving them all identifiers, I mean, you can make their job more confusing by saying, gosh, which one of these are citing data and which are, well, why don't we just count them all?
And there's a problem there at the moment in that it isn't clear that the groups like ISI, Web of Science, will track data citations.
So we're working with them. So Data Cite is working with Web of Science to try to get the data that's cited through the consortium to be visible and counted there.
Good.
So the goal to sort of use the process so that people can't just count and they have to go and do publications? We'll just expand a little bit more on sort of the picture.
The idea is to try to create this sort of greater visibility and hope that good things will be allowed to happen. I mean, by other people.
You have to change the culture simultaneously, but if there's no information, like this is why now the PLOS journals, for example, and other journals are trying to release information on impact of individual papers openly, as opposed to having to go to ISI or wherever, and you can get information about that. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to change the culture, but if you have a paper that was downloaded 265 million times, and you're competing with someone who has no papers that have ever been read, you might be able to leverage. I mean, it doesn't change the practice, but information about these things, about tracking data sets, is useful. And this was one of the problems, again, with GenBank, is that there were GenBank IDs, but nobody cited GenBank IDs in their papers.
But 25 years ago or something, people figured out who they should give tenure to without all this stuff.
Oh, no, yeah, right.
So, in some sense, maybe we just need to
go back to not using counts of metrics and things. Yes, absolutely.
But what I like about that remark is that in the previous discussion, I thought we shouldn't exaggerate that too much. You don't need recognition, explicit recognition from every single step you make. I mean, almost in various exceptions, but almost always, if you create data, it's linked to a paper or some papers, you get the recognition anyway. If it's generally usable data, they can make it sound a lot, so you don't need additional incentives really. There's very few cases where I have one case where I really create data that I don't have a research purpose for, but I know is very useful, where I would like a data paper. But okay, that'd be one out of hundreds of papers I write for, out of many, So it's not going to be a make or break case, and I would think that's going to be very rare. It's it's nice, it's important that you can do this, but it's not. There's more important
To
things.
me, it's more for tracking the information
Yeah,
and
that's
for
all, yeah.
using it. I mean, like, it's for tracking who's using the data and how they're using it so that you can then look at other publications associated with it and making it more openly and freely available as opposed to...
It's discovery's version,
Yeah,
and it's
yeah.
building the scripts, like it's that version from that repository that creates all kinds of opportunities.
Yeah, perhaps want to speak more about that, but the role of these things, we've said something in the realm of acknowledgement, but you've spoken often on reproducibility of the existing science. Is there, in what way does having the data on these archives and then having object identifiers pointing to those things enable that?
Well,
What's the role of archives and versioning and identifiers?
the question answers itself in a sense, right? Because just saying, well, I use this data set, you know, what exactly, when did you download it? And there's ways of trying to narrow that down, but if there's an identifier, you can, if you put in your R script and download it, there's no ambiguity left. So I think it's pretty self-evident.
And to get there, is that a cultural change that has to happen, or is that simply a lack of technology that we don't have?
No, I think so. That's the other thing. Yeah, another follow-up on, like, I think largely in practical. I mean, the turtle example is nice because that I think is a difficult case. Somebody doing year by year research is incremental, and after 16 years, you know, apologize for saying because you will do 10 more years, you'll be scrutiny on data. That's kind of a real extreme case. But by and large, it's just that people are afraid. Where they really don't need to, and it's just that's where I said yesterday the journal editors are so important. It just has to be forced to do it in publishing good journals, and the culture that just to make the culture change happening is realizing this is just how you do public science.
Yeah,
and by and large, you know, and I had two cases last year where I reviewed modeling papers, not data papers, but about modeling, and neither made their models available as source. In both cases, I rejected for that reason. And in both cases, got accepted by the editor. So we need to work on some editors as well. But I just, you know, because the mathematical notation in the paper was elegant. But how do you know how it's really implemented? And half the code is for never in those notations anyway. There's all kinds of little additional things. So I just think that's not science.
So we're running out of time here, so perhaps we should let John finish up his comments in the last few minutes, if we can.
Yeah. So I'll just let's see. What do I want to stress here? So just going back to this identifier service EDID, it's at a location where there's a user interface. Anyone can go to it and you can actually play with it. There's a help tab. You can, without an account, you can go and generate identifiers and play with them. I add metadata to your heart's content. They behave just like long-term identifiers, except that they're short-term. they will disappear. And so you can resolve them, etc. So Dryad was our first customer. And they've been using it very heavily and successfully. They do all their work to the programming interface, which allows them to do bulk operations and sorts of stuff. So, you know, identifiers can be used for anything. We're always very, domain agnostic, content agnostic. We are actually using identifiers, this system, for identifying, users. So living beings, abstract, vocabulary terms, digital objects, physical objects. And we're also scheme agnostic, so we support ARC identifiers and DOI identifiers, and we'll be doing others soon. There's just boring interface stuff which you can't see, but
we can make the presentation available later on.
I have a good question. So I think you can lay out, because we've walked through this some, you get the impression, I was at this workshop yesterday too, that it's sort of like archiving, that's what we're talking about here. But in fact, you have data entry, you have archiving, you have curation, you have storage, retrieval, and sharing and so forth. So that the way we've built this in for this NIH proposal we put in, that is that we have sharing. You upload your data at an early stage. This isn't sort of like, okay, we're done with the project or the program and now let's go archive it.
Yeah.
It's a much more active and dynamic concept, and I don't think that's come across in this workshop yet. Maybe you could speak to that just a bit.
Well, you put it pretty well, actually. I think one of the things we tried to do was to decouple identifier assignment from the repository, because we recognize that a lot of people, they'll work with some data for a long time, and just at the point where they decide, this is great data, it's valuable, I'm going to archive it, that's when it tends to get a new name, just at that moment, which is this really stupid practice. So we need to give it a good persistent preservation-worthy identifier. We'd like to give you that name as early as possible. So you can come to us and get names for things, and we may never see them.
But you have a name. But I mean, you can still share it. You can have restricted access and so on and so forth.
So you could also deposit early versions and get a name and then share it, which is also very useful. So
I get the impression early version means when you start collecting the data and you've sort of finished an experiment, that you can put it in your folders there and still restrict access. But this is where it won't get lost, because all of us have lost a lot of data.
And getting people to think about this rather than right at the end.
That's right.
Is really important. A dynamic process as opposed to, as you're saying, a static.
Yeah, everything we've learned in the archiving business is that archiving is thought of way too late.
Yeah.
All our interventions are expensive and unsatisfactory. And if we can push as much as we can upstream towards the producer as early as possible, that's where we're.
But your service, I mean, you get your data on there very early, and so the archiving is sort of the last step of a longer process.
Yeah. So the service is essentially an access kind of hosting service.
Yeah. And it's one of the major limitations of a service like Data Dryad, that it's thinking of just published paper data rather than having access to data.
But that's their cost model is associated with the journal.
Yeah.
So can I just, in relation to what you were saying about tenure, and we figured this out before, I got these two quotes, they're very short, that I thought I would read, that came from a National Academy report on data sharing. It's a really nice report. It came out a couple years ago. Tony Tyson from Davis was involved in this. And I think these sort of capture what I think everybody should be thinking of. Whatever differences there may be between practices of and policies on data sharing, and whatever legitimate restrictions may be put on data access, practically all research could benefit from more systematic sharing along the entire course of the project. And then they had this thing, which I think came from another site actually. Openness means access on equal terms for the international research community at the lowest possible cost, preferably at no more than the marginal cost of dissemination. Open access to research data from publicly funded projects should be easy, timely, user-friendly, and preferably internet-based. So it's not about getting tenure or getting credit or, it's about the benefits that come to the scientific community from sharing and releasing and accessing data. And that's, to me, what I think a lot of this should be about. And all the other things, maybe the carrots and the sticks that we use to get it to work well, but...
Tony's a physicist, and you look at what the archive that the physicists do for their preprints. I mean, it used to be that they did what the rest of us do. If you had written up something, you might possibly share it with sort of your 10 closest friends. But now by sharing it with everybody, the science progresses much, much faster. It's actually equalizes stuff much more around the world. So it's a very different model. Whereas a lot of ecologists would still be very nervous about sharing a preprint until it's accepted. Some of that's tied to the different ways in which journals, the reviewing and acceptance process occurs in different fields too.
Yeah, no, I mean, like they said in this thing, there may be legitimate cultural differences between different communities that might constrain this, but there are benefits that come. And what we should be talking about is the benefits. And then all these other things are ways to try and get to that goal.
And that largely reflects what we're intending to cover. To wrap up, what we're intending to cover tomorrow is to talk about the future benefits that can come from data archiving, what kinds of new possibilities are opened up through having data archiving as a mainstream event that most scientists would engage in. So we should probably wrap it up here. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.